Okay, broadcast pressing.
Vamos a empezar en un minuto. Para los que se están sumando. 1 minute. Okay, Robert Nixon, you ready? Should I start?
You got it.
Okay. So, hola a todos, mi nombre es María Martí, soy presidente del Ayn Rand Center Latinoamérica y les damos la bienvenida a la segunda parte del primer curso que estamos organizando conjuntamente entre el Ayn Rand Center, ThinkSpot y Stephen Hicks. Quiero agradecer a Nixon y a Robert que están detrás de cámaras haciendo un buen trabajo para que todo salga bien, así que muchas gracias Robert y Nixon. Y la segunda parte va a ser sobre el tema del egoísmo. El curso se llama Nietzsche versus Rand, sobre altruismo y sobre egoísmo. En la primera parte del sábado pasado tratamos el tema del altruismo, las diferencias en la visión de este concepto entre Rand y Nietzsche. Todos aquellos que no hayan podido participar de la primera parte seguramente han recibido un link al video y si no, se comunican con el Ayn Rand Center a través de Facebook o sus redes sociales y se las podemos hacer llegar. En el día de hoy vamos a tratar las diferencias en el concepto de egoísmo que estos dos intelectuales, Rand y Nietzsche, han presentado. El sábado que viene es la tercera sesión, es la última sesión en donde vamos a hacer un Q&A, así que todas las preguntas que tengan sobre las dos primeras sesiones y sobre Rand y Nietzsche las van a poder evacuar el sábado que viene al mismo horario, a las 2 p.m. hora argentina, con Stephen Hicks. Stephen Hicks, para los que se unen por primera vez hoy, es Ph.D. en filosofía, es profesor de la Universidad de Rockford y autor de varios libros, entre ellos Explicando el posmodernismo y Nietzsche y los nazis. Así que sin mucho más, Stephen, welcome back. Thank you for being here. And we will start with egoism. What Rand and Nietzsche think about egoism. So thank you very much. Welcome again. And the audience is for you.
All right. Thanks for the welcome and the introduction. Very gracious. Yes, this is part 2, and last time we looked at Nietzsche and Rand in terms of their critiques of altruism, and as we saw, the recording of all of that is available at ThinkSpot and other places, but primarily at ThinkSpot. For those interested in that background, there is a significant amount of overlap between Nietzsche and Rand in their criticisms of their common enemy in this case. But we also saw that there were some fundamental issues that started to emerge that led to a divergence in their interpretations of altruism. And when we turn to the positive, we're going to find that those fundamental differences, what they mean by the self, self-interest, and egoism, become even more important, and their views diverge. Nonetheless, both of them do have a strong reputation and a deserved reputation for being individualists, advocates of egoism, selfishness, and so forth. And I want to start with one of the reasons why. It's rhetoric like this that we find from Rand, for example. This is from the Fountainhead. Throughout the centuries, right, there were men who took first steps down new roads, armed only with the strength of their own vision. And here we find themes being sounded, right? You take your first steps down new roads. So you are the one taking the steps, and it's a new road that no one else has gone before. And you are doing so because it's your vision about where you want to go or where you want to explore. So the idea then is the contrast to being a follower or being a conformist, independence of vision, taking your own steps, making your own way in life. And those themes are powerful. We find similar themes of individuality and egoism in Nietzsche in quotations such as the following: celebrating your own uniqueness as a human being. And so this from his Untimely Meditations. At bottom, every man knows well enough that he is a unique being. Only once on this earth, and by no extraordinary chance, will such a marvelously picturesque piece of diversity and unity as he is ever be put together a second time. So the uniqueness, the specialness, the individuality of each of us, we find Nietzsche stressing that, but also emphasizing it's marvelous, and we should all thrill to the uniqueness that we are as individuals. But I want to say that while Nietzsche and Rand both will talk a lot about individuals, selfishness, egoism, and so forth, one of the very important philosophical lessons is that in many cases, people who use similar terminology are talking about very different things fundamentally. They don't even mean really the same thing by the words. And in many cases, their underlying philosophical premises, when they justify that position or explicate that phrase and its implications, they can very often mean very different things. So I want to just give an example here from Hegel, another person about whom there's great controversy in interpretation. But you can find when you read Hegel, him saying things like, we should be free and that we should all realize our true self. So freedom is realizing your true self. And if you're an advocate of freedom and self-interest and individuals, and you want to make something of your life, this is thrilling. And it sounds like he's a kind of liberal. But then the question is, when you start reading further into Hegel and you ask the natural question, well, what does he mean by your true self? And it turns out he doesn't really mean your concrete individual self that you often think of yourself. He says your true self really just is an aspect of this collectivized absolute self that is out there in reality somewhere. You're just a fragment of some larger being beyond yourself. The logic then indicates that freedom for Hegel means that you should be realizing this absolute self, not necessarily your individual self, concrete self. And then he goes on in other works to argue that what he means by the absolute self is this very abstract process, universalizing process, but back in the real world here, in the concrete world, the absolute self realizes itself in the state, that the government or the state is the realization or the embodiment of what the absolute self is all about. And so then if you draw the logic, what Hegel ends up concluding is freedom means doing what the state says absolutely. And at that point, you're starting to say, whoa, this is completely different from the initial phrase. Now, that's just meant to be an example, but you have to pay attention to defining the terms and figuring out what the underlying premises are. And this is what we are going to find when we start looking more deeply into Nietzsche and Rand. Now, Nietzsche himself argues, even though he has a reputation for being an aphoristic thinker, a somewhat scattered thinker, and he has rhetorical reasons for doing so. He doesn't want just to lay everything out in a recipe for us to follow. He wants us to put different things together and so on. But nonetheless, he cautions against saying that there is no system or no connection between everything that he says from top to bottom. And here again, as he likes to do, yes.
1 second. If you are trying to share screen, we are not seeing anything. So I
am
think you are sharing right now.
Okay, I should be. All right, let me do a double check here. Okay, so thanks for that. All right, good. Okay, so let me just backtrack for
now it's
one.
okay.
Is that coming across then?
Yes.
Okay, good. So here's the quotation from Rand. Thanks for the correction. Right, the one from Nietzsche. Here's what I was talking through in the case of Hegel. And now we're on to this one here. Okay, very good. So we'll just pick up at this point. So here's Nietzsche urging against any sort of disconnected, scattered view. There is a fundamental philosophy out of which all of his views arise. So our ideas, our values, our yeas and nays, our ifs and buts grow out of us with the necessity with which a tree bears fruit, related, and each with an affinity to each, and evidence of one will, one health, one soil, one sun. So everything is connected, and we have to interpret his remarks about egoism, self-interest, altruism, and so on in terms of his underlying philosophy. And of course, Rand stresses the systematicity necessary for doing philosophy well also. Now, this is just for outside of this lecture, but at my website, I've posted what I call a Nietzsche and Rand comparison table that I've been working on for quite a few years now. And what I've done is I've gone through 124 philosophical and cultural issues that Nietzsche and Rand both have something to say about. And they're in a table. So here's the issue, here's what Nietzsche says, here's what Rand says with the sources, so you can if you want to do a deeper dive yourself, follow some of that and add to it, and of course, any corrections as well. And the point is going to be that when I have done this on these 124 issues that are deep issues, does God exist? Do humans have free will? Do we have an immortal soul? Are ethics objective? Should we be advocates of slavery or not? What I find is on only 21 out of those 124 issues do Rand and Nietzsche agree with each other. Instead, they explicitly disagree with each other on 95 issues. And there are about 8 issues where they seem to sort of agree, or there might be an overlap, or sometimes Nietzsche or Rand seems to have shifted in their position at different points in their intellectual careers. And then even when you look at the things that they agree upon, the 21 things, again, this is my interpretation, so feel welcome to disagree when you go yourself. 9 of those are what I call negative agreements. That is to say, they agree with common enemies. They both think that Plato was a bad guy, or that Christianity is a problem, and so forth. And on positive issues, there's only 12 issues. That then is to say, less than 10% of issues do they have substantial positive agreements with each other. The source is at my website for those interested in doing their own deeper dive. Now, our topic today, of course, is egoism. Selfishness is one of those words that, again, people use it very differently. And so the first philosophical lesson is, what do we mean by selfishness? Getting that straight. When we do moral philosophy, what is it to be good or bad? And what are the good and the bad? There's lots of sub-issues, things that we are attending to. Sometimes we're asking whether the person has good or bad intentions. And sometimes we're fine with the person's intentions, but we don't like how they are trying to act on the basis of their intentions. So you might have good or bad intentions, but your action also, to some extent, can vary independently. You can do the things for the right reason, but do them in the wrong way. And then we're also interested in the results of the actions, or the consequences of the actions. So we need to attend to, in formulating an understanding of any situation, the reasons why, how the person did it, and what the actual results were, to give a full evaluation of a circumstance. And then typically, since many of our actions do involve other people, when we're looking at the results, we're interested in the results for ourselves, as well as the results for other people. Now, what we will find, of course, is that a concept like selfishness, we all know that it's a button-pushing word, and that often is. It's not only that whether people are advocates or not of selfishness, but they often mean different things by selfishness. So there are people in the world who will say, I am selfish, and what that means is, in my intent. I'm looking at the predator column. I'm interested in myself, what I take to be my own interests. But what I will do in order to achieve my interests is take from other people. So I see other people as my victims, and as a result, selfishness for me means acting like a predator. I benefit myself at the expense of other people. And if that's what I mean by selfishness, and I endorse that as an ethic, then I'm an advocate of a certain predatory kind of selfishness. And then what we will find, of course, is that there are other people who say you should not be selfish in that sense. Predation is wrong. Many altruists are in this camp. They will say naturally human beings are predators, but we should try to rise above our animal predatory nature. We should not act in our self-interest. We should be selfless. Rather than taking from other people, we should give to other people. We should be willing to sacrifice. That is to say, to give up and end up in a net loss position as long as that benefits other people. And that's what it is to be a good person. And basically a good person means not being selfish, but selfish defined in that predatory sense. But then, of course, there are others who are advocates of kinds of egoism that don't accept altruism or predation, and they will say, we are advocates of selfishness, and what we mean is acting on the basis of your best self-interest. But what is your best self-interest? Your best self-interest is, in action, to take charge of your own life and to produce, be a creative, productive person, and create the values that you want to see realized in the world, not to take from other people. And if you do that, if you are a productive person, then of course you will benefit yourself. But the nature of being a productive person means that in terms of social values, if you are a net productive person, that's good for other people because then you can trade with them. And of course, to the extent that other people are pursuing their interests productively, they're going to create stuff and you can trade with them. And so egoism, according to this understanding of selfishness, should end up in a more mutually beneficial approach. Now, that is then to get things clarified, and unfortunately, in much philosophical discussion, people just automatically assume that there's one meaning of selfishness, and we end up talking past each other. Now, Rand and Nietzsche both are very well aware of this issue and the different interpretations of selfishness, predation, and egoism. They clarify their concepts and they clarify their enemies just on this issue as well. So let's follow their lead. Now, before we can then say, is selfishness a good thing or is self-interest a good thing? Should we be in favor of it or not? There are more basic philosophical questions that we have to ask. And the most important one is, well, what is the self? What do you take this thing to be that is a self that you think has interests that you're going to endorse or not? So you have to have a theory of human nature explicit before you can turn to start doing your ethics. And once you've identified what you take the self to be, am I a soul? Am I a body? My reason, my emotions? Am I in charge of myself or not? All of those issues. Well, what are then the core interests of the self? And you need to identify what those things are. Are you saying that self-interest is a standard of value? And the standard is a much more abstract general principle instead of talking about particular interests that may or may not feed into that more general understanding and satisfy it or not. Do you think that self-interests, that is to say yours and mine, are what I call mutually satisfiable? That is to say, given how you think selves are and what their interests are and what actions are necessary to achieve those, do you think that your pursuing your self-interest is fundamentally harmonious with mine or fundamentally in conflict with each other? That is to say, you can satisfy your interests and I can satisfy my interests, and that's a mutually satisfactory result. Or is it the case that given your account so far that you think that we are in conflict with each other and that if you satisfy your interests, that necessarily means I'm not going to, and vice versa? And then on the basis of all of that, kind of then generalize, what do you think our policies should be of how we think, how we use our minds, how we act? How should we be engaging in the world as a matter of policy? And all of those questions are questions that you then are answering before you end up with a conclusion that says, yes, I'm in favor of egoism or I am opposed to egoism. And that's precisely what deep thinkers like Nietzsche and Rand are doing. Now, this is a death by PowerPoint list here, but in the case of Ayn Rand, her understanding of rational self-interest that she is most favorite for, or the virtue of selfishness as she goes out of her ways to define it, wants to say life is individual, human beings, and then the achievement of what's necessary for their lives, that is the standard of value. What gets good and bad off the ground is there's a distinction between life and death. That we as organisms face, and that which enables us to survive and flourish, that's the good, or that maps onto the good, and anything that is a threat to us or absolutely kills us, that is the bad. So that does serve as the standard. But unlike other animal species, we have free will. We need to use our minds volitionally to discover, to decide what we're going to do, to initiate action. So we don't act automatically by instincts or by automatic behaviors. And so that's why we need to have a moral code. We need to identify rationally, right, with our minds, and this is in our primary moral tool of survival, what kind of beings we are, what kind of world we're living in, and then what kind of actions are necessary to engage. And that given that our minds are under our control to a significant extent, we can shape our own minds, our habits, our emotions. Man is a being of self-made soul, as Rand goes on to argue. But we don't just go out and hunter-gatherer in the environment. What we need to do is be productive beings, engaging in farming, engaging in making of tools and machines and so forth, and that is a glorious human trait. But Rand also then stresses that all of these things are individual traits. We need to think for ourselves, we need to act for ourselves, and we need to be able to control the fruits of our product and so forth. And so life has individuality right built into it. But Rand goes on to argue that socially, since we all have different talents and different productive abilities, if we are all rational and productive, then by living socially, in family units, in business units, and more impersonal markets and so forth, we're going to realize that we're not in fundamental conflict with each other, but rather we can be mutually beneficial by interacting with each other. So we should commit to being productive, trading, and then respecting other individuals, having their own ideas and their own modes of action and their own productivity, that we're going to respect that and only trade with them on a voluntary basis. And so we're, of course, going to need laws, but those laws should be equally respectful of all individuals living their lives as individuals. Now, that's a thumbnail sketch of the kind of rational egoism that Rand is in favor of. Now, when we turn to Nietzsche, though, we're going to find that on pretty much everything on this list, Nietzsche disagrees. He doesn't think life is the standard. He doesn't think we have volition. He doesn't think reason is the primary tool, et cetera, et cetera. And now I want to turn to documenting that. And this is what I mean by saying fundamentally, Nietzsche and Rand philosophically are very different, even to the point where what they mean by egoism is a very different thing. So first question, if you're going to believe in self-interest and advocate self-interest, one question would be, do you think that selves are real? Do selves exist? And as we know, in the history of philosophy, there are many philosophers who don't think there are such things as selves or as individuals, and so they're in a completely different philosophical world. But notice these sorts of quotations that I've drawn here from Friedrich Nietzsche. There is no such thing as a unified, integrated self, an I, a me, that is an entity that hangs together, and my life is some sort of an integrated phenomenon. Instead, what Nietzsche says is things like the human is the combat of a vast confusion of contradictory valuations and consequently of contradictory drives. So there is no such thing as a you. There's just maybe a bunch of yous, and that they are in conflict and struggle with each other. And so he says then more explicitly a little bit later, the assumption of one single subject is perhaps unnecessary. more strongly, we might say, well, at least in our minds, we have it together, and it's our minds, it's our autonomous agency that directs the course of our lives. He denies that. Consciousness is not the unity of the organism. And then in a longer quotation, this is from the mature, later Nietzsche, for the individual, the single man, as people and philosophers have hitherto understood him, is an error. There is no individual. He does not constitute a separate entity, an atom, a link in the chain, something merely inherited from the past. He constitutes the entire single line man, up to and including himself. So what you are is all of your ancestors manifested in a particular entity at a particular time, but you are not a unique individual. You are kind of a collective, evolving entity. Now that then undercuts the idea that there is such a thing as a self that is a unique individual that has its own interests and so forth. Now, a second point, if we're going to have a moral philosophy and advocate that one should do various things, and one of the assumptions of that is that you have free will. You can make choices, and that we can hold people responsible for the choices that they make. And this is why Rand's language is so often moralistic, is that she thinks fundamentally we are constantly in the process of making value judgments, and we should be consciously making value judgments to the extent that we possibly can. We are deeply moral agents and should be held responsible for how we use our minds and bodies and so on. And what we find in the case of Nietzsche, that his answer to this question is no, emphatically, repeatedly. We are before, quote, a brazen wall of fate, right? Fate rules. We are in a prison. We can only dream ourselves free, not make ourselves free. This next quotation, a single human being is a piece of fatum, right? Fated from the front and from the rear, one law more, one necessity more for all that is yet to come and to be. Everything is fated and has been from the beginning of time to the end of time. Further, the voluntary is absolutely lacking. Everything has been directed along certain lines from the beginning. And then he goes on to dismiss the idea that we should be moral thinkers and giving recommendations about what people ought to do and ought not to do and so forth. So he then says, a man as he ought to be. Right? That sounds to us as insipid as a tree as he ought to be. Well, trees don't have free will. You can't go out and urge the tree to be a better version of itself. The tree is just going to do what the tree has to do according to the laws of nature operating on it. So that's undercutting the entire moral project if you think that some sort of strong determinism is true. Now, are values universal? One form of egoism, of course, wants to say every individual has the same rational capacity and a responsibility for exercising that capacity. So we're all moral agents and we all have the same general values. We need purpose and meaning in our lives. We need to be formulating our own character, our virtues, our habits, and so forth. And so at a general level, those values are universal to the species. We are all human beings. And of course, that's one of the things that comes out in Rand's political philosophy. We should have universal rights, and a right is a kind of social value that should be universally extended to the human species. But what we find in the case of Nietzsche is, and this is overlapping some with last week's, is that he does not think there is a unitary set of values for all human beings. There is the distinction between the predator type of human being and the prey type of human. Those that are strong and aggressive and assertive and have their act more together, and those that are weak and vacillating and not quite sure what they're all about. Those that are much more individualistic and and adventuresome, and those that are more fearful and want to stick in the group and so forth. And each of these types then generates a different kind of moral code, what he then goes on to call the master type morality and the slave type morality. And Nietzsche then says there is no such thing as a universal moral code because human beings are too different. And then he goes on to say, while I recognize this herd morality, this slave morality that I think is kind of disgusting, nonetheless, that's fine for that type of person, but that moral code should be reserved only for that type of person. And so the ideas of the herd should rule the herd, right, but not reach out beyond it. So there are no universal values for the human beings. Now, where do we get our values from? Another meta or ethics question or fundamentals of ethics question. Are they written out there in the world? What we call the intrinsicist theory. Most religions, for example, ascribe to an intrinsic theory that they're written on tablets or they are commandments delivered by God, and they are out there in the world completely independent of human beings. Of course, subjectivists in this philosophical sense want to say that we just make it up. Reality has nothing to do with what our values are. It's all just an internal, perhaps emotionalist or whim or some sort of just ideas that I really want to believe in, and I project my values onto the world. And then Rand, in the Aristotelian tradition, wants to argue that values really are a relational phenomenon. There are certain facts about the world that are objectively true. There are certain facts about human beings that are objectively true. And what we call a value is a relational phenomenon. Right? There are certain needs that we have and certain things that are out there in the world, and there's a relationship between them, and that's a factual relationship, and so we should act in accordance with that relationship. And so objectivity is the source of values. Now, in this case, what Rand wants to argue, of course, is that intrinsicism and subjectivism are false, and so she's advocating the objectivist ethics, as she describes it in her most theoretical essay on this subject. Nietzsche, by contrast, is explicitly a subjectivist. Now, you'll find both of them, Rand and Nietzsche, beat up on and are harshly critical of the intrinsicists, but when they turn to the positive, give an account of where values come from, they disagree fundamentally. So in this case here, from Beyond Good and Beyond Good and Evil, we have Nietzsche saying quite explicitly, genuine philosophers, right, however, are commanders and legislators. They say, thus it shall be. Right? Their knowing is creating, their creating is legislation, their will to truth is will to power. That is to say, we all have this will inside us subjectively, this idea, this vision that's unique, that I want to impose on the world. Right? So I am legislating or creating right on the world. And that, from Nietzsche's perspective, is the opposite of saying there's any input from the world trying to tell me what I should and should not be doing. So he is very much in the subjectivist cast. So our more quotations here. Our moral judgments and evaluations are only images and fantasies based on a physiological process unknown to us. So that then is to say there's stuff that goes on inside us, drives, instincts, and so forth that manifest themselves in our minds. And so they then become fantasies in our minds. And then on the basis of that, we formulate moral judgment. So it's entirely an inside out process, a very deep subjectivity. So that then is to say, when we have more specific moral concepts like liberty, justice, freedom, responsibility, and so forth, those are all going to have to be interpreted for Nietzsche on radically subjectivist grounds. So the last one here from the gay science or joyous science, as we now typically translate that, justice is by all means a matter of taste, nothing more. So how does ice cream taste? What's the best kind of ice cream? Well, it's just a matter of subjective preference. So Nietzsche is explicitly arguing that even an important moral and political concept like justice really is, it's just a subjective matter of taste. Rand, by contrast, wants to argue if we're going to live socially in a mutually beneficial fashion, then we need to define objectively standards of justice, sorting out what's yours, what's mine, what properly you are responsible for, what properly I am responsible for. It's not just a matter of subjective taste. Now, if we're going to do any sort of thinking about ethics, one of the natural questions is not just what do I think I should do and what are the right answers, but how do I go about doing this entire project? Should I think? Should I be a scientist? Should I talk with other people? Should I debate, discuss, and so forth? What methods do we use in order to identify our nature and our values? Rand wants to argue that ethics should be a kind of science. Mostly it is a qualitative science, but we need to say there are facts about human beings, facts about the world, our needs, our capacities, and then the nature of the way things go when we perform this kind of action as opposed to that kind of action. There's a difference between watering our plants with actual water as opposed to acids because of the facts involved and so forth. Whereas Nietzsche is wanting to argue that reason is not at all part of the process. It wants to say things like, here again from Beyond Good and Evil, our best faculty for figuring out what our values are is instinct. Instinct is, of all the kinds of intelligence that have been discovered so far, the most intelligent. So he's then appealing again to a subjectivity. In this case, it's a cognitive subjectivity. If you want to find out what you really should think and believe, do some deep dive inside and figure out what your strongest instincts are. And he bemoans that time in the past when human beings developed a consciousness and started to become more rational and trying to figure out theoretically the way the world worked. And he wanted to say that that marked a change in the human mode of living for the worse. This is from Genealogy of Morals, where he says, sadly, in this new world, they, this is to say men, no longer possess their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. Now notice what he's saying is infallible drives that are unconscious. That's a better guide if we can get back to them. Instead, we are reduced to inferring, thinking, reckoning, trying to coordinate cause and effect, these unfortunate creatures. That is to say, us rational human beings, they were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ. So while someone like Rand is glorifying the power of human reason and the fact that we can all be smart and through science and other forms of great energy, figure out the way the world works and live on the basis of our rational understanding of the world, Nietzsche is dismissive of that entire mode of trying to function consciously. Moving on, many times egoists will say that individuals are ends in themselves. I have my life, my goals, my dreams, and the same thing holds for you. That I should not see you as a means merely to my ends or as a tool that I can just use however I want. And I should have great fierceness and dignity in protecting my own rights and dignity. My life is mine. I'm an end in myself. And certainly that rhetoric is powerful in Rand. But notice what happens when we turn again to Nietzsche. He says, absolutely not. Individuals are not ends in their lives, in themselves, because it depends what kind of a human being you are. And then he goes on to argue that some of us, of course, are weaklings and herd animals and a disgrace to what it is to be a human being. And by nature, that's the way we are. And it's only a very few of us who have some potential to improve the human condition. And so he wants to say is, some of us are going to be ends in ourselves, maybe, but the vast majority of us are not. And he says, no, if he, that's to say, any individual represents the ascent of the line man, then his value is in fact extraordinary, and care for the preservation and encouragement of his growth may legitimately be extreme. But that's my interspersion there. If he represents a declining line, and this is the vast majority of people, then he has little value. And the first demand of justice is that he take as little room, force, and sunshine from the well-bred as possible. I'll pause for a moment. Notice especially this final line, since our topic is about egoism. In this case, society has the duty of suppressing egoism. So that then is to say, if I'm reading Nietzsche correctly, the vast majority of people Nietzsche thinks should not be egoists. And if they try to be egoists, society should shut them down and suppress them. And that's a fairly ominous type of quotation. Now, often egoism and self-interest is to say that we are individuals with our own minds, goals, dreams, rights, and so forth. And again, Nietzsche is quite explicitly in rejecting any sort of individualistic interpretation of what he is about. So here he's saying explicitly, my philosophy aims at the establishing of hierarchy, not at that of an individualistic morality. For the question is this, carrying on, how can your life, the individual life, retain the highest value, the deepest significance? What makes your life meaningful and significant? Is it you as an individual and in yourself? And he goes on to finish this quotation, no, only by your living for the good of the rarest and most valuable specimens, and not for the good of the majority. So it's not your life. Your life is good because you are serving something beyond yourself and not those disgusting lesser human beings, those special, the brilliant ones, the geniuses, and so forth. Whoever are the great ones, you have significance only to the extent that you're living for the good of them and making it possible for them to achieve their results. Do I think, another question here, that egoism is fundamentally about mutual respect for life, trade, we're trying to get along with each other, or is it the case that we think human life is fundamentally conflictual? And Rand, of course, is on the side of saying that among rational human beings, they're committed to productivity and trade. There are no fundamental conflicts of interest, and those that arise, we should be able to sort them out through conversation, benevolence, and sometimes judicious compromise if necessary. Nietzsche has nothing but scorn for that approach to life. He does believe life is fundamentally win-lose, conflictual. Here, one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life is essentially, the italics are in the original, life is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and the weak, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. So we're all trying to exploit each other, conquer each other, appropriate from each other in order to achieve our own interests and thereby rise up to whatever. People then, this is the 19th century, and Nietzsche is scornful at the liberals and the socialists and the Democrats who say, hey, then modern science says we should all be able to get along with each other. We should be able to rise above all of the previous exploitation. And Nietzsche, in this quotation, is just utterly dismissive of that entire approach. People are raving, even under the guise of science, about getting rid of the exploiting character. He says, no, you can't do that. That's just not the nature of life. Life is exploitation. So as a result of that, when he is articulating the warrior type of character and a lot of the adventure and romanticism that we find very attractive, most of us, in when we read Nietzsche for the first time when we are young, and he has said things like, live dangerously, right? Build your cities under Vesuvius, send your ships into uncharted seas, all of that adventure seeking out stuff. But notice that he goes on to say, live at war with your peers and yourselves. And so it's war and conflict that is fundamental. That is what he is urging on. Bring out the inner warrior in your being. Now, war, we might say, oh, this is a rhetorical flourish. He just means it metaphorically. So let's turn to what does Nietzsche mean with respect to war and, of course, other value-laden political concepts. Rand, of course, believes in individual rights as universal and absolute. And among those are liberty rights, and that we should have equal principles and equality before the law. We all have different particular goals, values, aptitudes, right, and so forth, but we at an abstract level have the same rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and those should be equally respected by our governments. And what we'll find is Nietzsche is, again, as a result of everything that we have said so far, dismissive of this entire trilogy. About rights, well, for the preservation of society, for making the possible higher and highest types, the inequality of rights is the condition. So some individuals should have more rights, some individuals should have less rights. Entire rejection there. Liberty, liberalism, he's always scornful of the 19th century liberals who are in favor of free markets and bringing peace about, that nations should trade with each other and get past their old-fashioned warlike past, that we should even extend liberty to the slaves and to women and so forth. And Nietzsche is just entirely disgusted and dismissive of that. We, this is the royal we are by no means liberal. There's not a liberal bone in his body, he wants to go on to argue. This then extends to slavery. Rand is disgusted by slavery and sees the elimination of slavery largely from the civilized parts of the world, and the attempts to extend that to the entire globe was one of the great achievements of modern self-interest, pursuit of happiness and capitalism. Nietzsche talks about slavery frequently throughout his career, and sometimes he is using the concept more metaphorically, sometimes more literally, and he has no problem at all with slavery. From Beyond Good and Evil, slavery is, as it seems, both in the cruder and in the more subtle sense, the indispensable means of spiritual cultivation or discipline and cultivation too. Now you'll notice he's saying in the cruder sense, that is the traditional sense that there's actual human beings who are slaves, who are enslaved. That's the crude sense. In the subtler sense, there's all kinds of, Nietzsche wants to say, psychological forms and socially subtle forms of slavery that we try to play with each other and enact with each other. He's in favor of those. And notice what he's saying is those are indispensable. Those have to exist. All right, now that's a marching through of some of the fundamental meta-ethical issues. And so while Nietzsche does have some praiseful things to say about egoism, self-interest, selfishness, individualism, and that network of concepts as well, it's very important when you are saying Nietzschean egoism, whatever you mean by that, that it's informed by understanding what his views are on all of the fundamental meta-ethical issues and the issues about human nature. For him, that does not involve any sort of liberalism, individualism in any universalistic sense, any sense that there's mutual harmony between the two of us, and so forth. And on all of those fundamental metaphysical issues, what we find is Rand says one thing, Nietzsche says another. So a quick and dirty version is to say that Rand is an advocate of rational self-interest, and what that means for her is the kind of egoism that should lead to productivity and mutually beneficial social relationships. For Nietzsche, by contrast, it's a much more predatory understanding of egoism that he is in favor of, but that predatory advocacy of egoism for him really only extends to the few human beings whom he thinks are capable not of living the life for their own sake, but rather raising the species to the overman status over and beyond ourselves. So if you're interested in the quotation sources and a whole lot more, you can go to my website and just Google Nietzsche and Rand. You'll find the post with the table listed there. Okay, so at that point, I'm going to stop my formal presentation and pat myself on the back because I think I did a good job this time of staying closer to time limits, and that means leaving room for questions. Good. Now, last time I gave preference to the ARCLA questions and the ones that were appearing at Zoom. So right now I'm going to this time give preference to the questions that are posted at the ThinkSpot site. And then I'll come back to the questions that are at Zoom. And then I've got questions that people have been sending me about this topic and others. If I have time for those, I will turn to those as well. Now, this is a lot of material that we've covered last time and this time. So let me just mention this time next week, we have another session that will be jointly hosted by Ayn Rand Center Latin America and ThinkSpot. Same time, same places, and that will be only questions. So between now and then, feel welcome to think, do any more research, any questions you have, go ahead and post them either at the ThinkSpot site or or if ARCLA make a place available, and we'll be able to spend the entire hour just going through all of those questions as deeply as we can. Okay, so let me now go to the ones that are here. This is from Individual Rights. Ayn Rand said, if men reject logic, then the tie between their mental processes and reality is severed. All cognitive standards are repudiated and anything goes. Any contradictions so on any subject may be endorsed and simultaneously rejected by anyone as and when he feels like it, unquote. Yeah, exactly. That's a very strong quotation. How does this apply to today's world and what can this lead to? Right. Well, of course, Rand and other Enlightenment thinkers wanted to argue that the great human capacity is the capacity for reason, and that logic is the tool that we should be using when we are using our reason, how we take all of the evidence and data that our senses present to us, sorted into categories, and then through fairly sophisticated methods, to tease out what the causal relationships between those are. And on the basis of that, even in most sophisticated forms, go on to do science. And so we're continuing to learn and develop scientific method. But the idea then is that it's by means of logic, however abstract and theoretical your principles become and your ideas become, by a process of logic, you can connect all the way down the chain to the initial data and or experimental results that get it off the ground. So you keep your ideas tied to reality. And then on the basis of that, that means then that when you and I are talking about issues, we can both engage in the same process of logic, double check each other's work, and we should ultimately then be able to come to agreement. And on the basis of that, that means that we should then be able to resolve our differences through a process of reasoning and logic, as opposed to trying to sort out our differences without reason and logic, which means the way that animals do whenever they do so. So what that then means is that a commitment to reason and logic underlies the idea that human beings can live together socially, peacefully. And so that then is going to mean that the converse of that, or the contradictory of that, is going to be the case. To the extent that we reject reason and logic, then we're not going to be able to live together under peace and harmony. We're just going to have differences and have to fight it out. Now, how does this apply to today's world? Well, of course, that's a huge question, but I imagine that the things that are in most people's minds are the protests, and a certain amount of the protesting is decent and a legitimate way of trying to communicate grievances, but a lot of it is bad-spirited and spilling out into conflict and violence and so forth. And to that extent, what we are finding explicitly is a large number of people who are not committed to reason and logic. They're not interested in a conversation. They're not interested in knowing why you might think differently about an issue. To the extent that you might think differently about an issue, they just want to intimidate you, threaten you, or enact violence upon you. If they have objections to a particular statue, and of course there's lots of objectionable statues out there, rather than having a discussion, and that we should be able to agree what statues are in public places or not, and remove the objectionable ones, they want to do it through violent and forceful means and so forth. So it means a breakdown of civil society fundamentally. And what that leads to is ultimately another dark ages. There's a question here again about part 1. Yes, that is available on video. So I will just make sure that the link is posted. And I know the ARCLA team and the ThinkSpot team, and at my posting at ThinkSpot, we're making sure that the video for the first time is available. This one also will be available as well. Okay, I'm looking in the Q&A now. Looks like I've got 3 questions here. First from Nicolas. How can we convince leftists that egoism is not the same as predation? Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, that's the great project, because in many cases, leftists come to their views not by any sort of empirical study of the world. They don't do a lot of history. They don't study political governance. and look at the results of political systems that are based on egoistic principles of respect for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They don't do an empirical study of markets and free markets and how, if we, again, respect people's egoistic rights to produce and trade and consume how they want, that harmoniously we all become more productive and wealthier as a result. So the longer road will be to say that we have to approach people when they are younger and get them to be empirical. That is to say, to be willing actually to look at what happens in free markets, what happens in societies that are based on individual rights, and that is to say, get them to read history and political theory, governance, and economics as well. Instead, the problem that most leftists have is that they come to their beliefs by reading academics and books, and of course, there are arguments that can be made for a very conflictual, exploiting, zero-sum understanding of the world, and that those theories can push people's fears of self-responsibility and their envy for those who have more and their resentment for certain kinds of injustices that are out there in the world. But in many cases, then what they do is that's the first kind of comprehensive worldview that they have read, and it kind of hangs together, and they make a kind of faith commitment to it. And the problem is that once someone makes a faith commitment to an ideological viewpoint, that they're very resistant to any sort of rational argumentation. You try to present charts and data and say, let's look at the empirical evidence, and they're just not interested in doing so. So the hard answer to this question is to say, it's an epistemological battle, or it's a cognitive battle. You have to first get people really willing to look at the evidence and to look at the arguments. Now, what I would say is rhetorically, particularly is if you are dealing with someone you think is younger and has just kind of mistakenly adopted a leftist viewpoint, is don't come across adversarially and harsh yourself. Give them the benefit of the doubt and say, I understand, how you might have come to believe this. And I understand, there is exploitation in the world. And there are, rich people who got rich through government favors, and that's an injustice. And I understand there are abuses of power. So come across that you understand where they come from. And to the extent that you then have a rapport, that the person sees that you are a decent person, committed to humane values, then to the extent that that person sees that about you, they'll be more willing to say, now if we start looking at the data, let's actually compare some socialist nations with some capitalist nations. Let's compare this with that, and so forth. There's no short answer, but there is a possibility at the individual level. The even harder answer, though, I think, is epistemological and more broadly philosophical. Leftist politics does typically come out of a broader ideological and philosophical framework. And in many cases, the politics isn't what's driving it fundamentally. As we see with Nietzsche, Nietzsche is not a leftist, and he's committed to a certain predatory viewpoint. So what we then have to do is find people who are committed to this predatory viewpoint. They might come out as leftists, or they might come out as Nietzscheans, or something on the far alt-right or something like that. So we have to be willing to go after the fundamentals. On economic terms, particularly in the case of young people, in many cases, young people who've not had jobs or had to work, and they don't have much experience of business, it often is just sheer ignorance, and not ignorance in the bad sense, of where wealth comes from. They've not produced wealth themselves. They have no idea what CEOs do, or what stock markets do, or what a bond is, and so on. And so it just seems like some sort of magical stuff that happens out there from their perspective. And so the fact that somehow some people end up with a lot of money and a lot of people are really struggling, that doesn't seem like intelligible to them. And so they're profoundly irritated by it. So better economic and business education, I think, would be another piece of the puzzle. Second question, do I consider myself an objectivist? My answer to that would be yes. My view is that Rand's philosophy on all of the major issues that I have studied and thought about is the one that is the most promising and the one that is laying out on most, but not all, of the major issues that philosophers have to do the right ones. What I would say, though, is that there are some fundamental issues that Rand did not address, and those need to be addressed. And on some issues, she stated what her position was, but she didn't develop an argument for it in any great depth, and so that still needs to be worked out as well. So what I would then say is, the labels are interesting, and they are a useful shorthand tag. But probably the more important thing is for each of us as individuals to think through all of the issues and get to the labels a little bit later. Make sure you're aware of all of the major alternatives, and that before you ascribe a label to yourself, make sure you're aware of what the alternatives are, what the positions are, and the arguments and how they fit together before you assign the label. From Mauricio Ayerdi, I see through your presentation that Nietzsche was a yonki of their own limbic system, the antique brain zone, in detriment of all of their neocortex. All their philosophy is based on war between human and biological interactions. Okay, that seems more of a statement, but yes, to put it shortly, Nietzsche is trying to say that philosophy really reduces to psychology, and psychology really reduces to biology, and biology reduces to kind of basic animal brain and animal system functions. You see their influence in our actual time on the world more than Marx, Engels, Kant style? That's an interesting question because Marx also was a kind of reductionist. He wanted to argue that the content of our philosophy and our moral philosophy is also reduced, but it's reduced to environmental circumstances. And so he did think of himself as a kind of scientist and as a materialist, but that whatever biology generates in us, it generates a relatively plastic or fluid or clay-like substance that is then put out into an environment, and it's the environment that does the major shaping of whom we end up becoming. And so what you then have is two competing versions of determinism, an environmental version of determinism versus a more biological form of determinism. And those of us who are, like Rand, advocates of volition, that yes, we are influenced by our biology, yes, we are influenced by our environments and our social upbringings, but nonetheless, each of us has the capacity to think for ourselves and to decide what influences we're going to accept or reject. That's a third alternative. But you're right is then to say, you're right to say that when we look around now, the biological versions of determinism are more prominent than the Marx Engels style of determinism. That I'm not sure is true. I would have said 20 years ago inside the academic world where I hang out most of the time, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, that the Marx Engels environmental determinism was much more prominent. That you found that in linguistic, not just with Marx Engels, but all sorts of environmental determinism. Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, and the various anthropologists. In linguistic form, the famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that language totally constructs how we think, and language is an external social product, as well as the Marxist and neo-Marxist versions. And 20 years ago, those ones were dominant. What we now call evolutionary psychology, at that point, we were more likely to call it sociobiology, the more biologically deterministic forms, coming from Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson and other thinkers like that. They were there, but they were a minority tradition. But I do think you're right that over the course of the last 20 years, there has been a significant uptick in evolutionary psychology, and that in many subsectors within the intellectual world, the stronger environmental determinist forms are declining. Oh, I forgot to mention behaviorism, which of course was prominent in the 20th century and a very strong environmental determinism as well. So it really is a three-way debate that we are in right now. Those who want to argue that volition is a kind of causal psychological force, it's a real force that human brains have evolved and developed, and we have to take volition and free will seriously, and those that want to deny it and push for, to some degree, either an environmental determinism or a biological determinism. All right, I am showing that we have reached the end of the hour, so I'm going to pause at this point. I do have a significant number of more questions, and I know that we did not get to those, but I promise they are on the list. And when I return next week for the Q&A session, I will plunge immediately into those, as well as any additional questions that you post. So happy thinking and reading about Nietzsche and Rand and these deep issues. Let me just once again plug that chart that I've posted at my website with 124 issues comparing Rand and Nietzsche and their quotations and their sources for hopefully an aid to your own research on this set of issues. Goodbye for now.